I'm Tracy Miranda, Executive Director of the CD Foundation, joining you from a surprisingly sunny Ottawa, Canada. And yes, super happy to be having this session today on the State of DevOps report, which, I love the State of DevOps report. And we're joined by two amazing folks. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, starting with you, Kellyanne.
Sure. Hi, Kelly Fitzpatrick. I am a senior industry analyst at Red Monk, and we are a developer-focused industry analyst firm, which means we follow a whole bunch of tech trends and tend to see things through the eyes of developers and other tech practitioners.
And I'm Dave Stanky. I'm a developer advocate with Google Cloud Platform, focused on DevOps and SRE, and I contributed to this year's State of DevOps report.
Great. Thank you both for being here. And so how it's going to work today, folks, Dave is going to give us an overview of the report. We know you're all busy and may not have had a chance to check out this year's insights, and there is a lot of good stuff in there. So we'll be covering that. Dave will go over that, and then you're free to ask questions, either drop comments or questions in the chat, or there's a specific Ask a Question button at the bottom of your screen. And then after the presentation, we'll be having a live discussion and we'll be going through your questions. And I certainly have lots and lots of questions about this year's reports and just digging deeper into several aspects. And so with that, I believe we can get started, everybody. So Dave, we'll let you take it away.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen here and should see, there we go. All right, so if folks aren't familiar, I'll give a brief intro to what this thing is. At Google, we have a division within our cloud organization called DORA, DevOps Research and Assessment. And this is an organization that for 8 years has been studying software teams across lots of companies, lots of industries, thousands of individuals across thousands of companies. And started independently of Google and became part of Google in 2018 and has continued its research. Every year, except 2020, because that's a weird year, every year we have put out a report called the State of DevOps report, or the Accelerated State of DevOps report, summarizing the status of what's going on in the industry and what we've learned. And every year we do some deep dives. So I'm going to give a quick overview of this year's report and what we've learned. But the biggest TLDR you can get from what I do here is go get the report yourself. It's brief. It's meant for executives, so it's got lots of big, bright colors. And even if you've read previous reports, strongly recommend checking out this year because there's some really interesting special topics that we've done. The way that we approach the research is we ask a whole bunch of practitioners what they do. And we ask them what kind of outcomes they get, outcomes specifically with regard to metrics that we have observed to be predictive of overall success. And we have a model, it's called a predictive model, that says certain capabilities that are practiced are predictive of positive outcomes. And this goes beyond positive outcomes for software delivery to positive outcomes for the business. So we really take all the way through to the end value view of what people should do. And in doing that, we're able to kind of offer some prescriptive advice about what things work in today's environment. And the first thing that we do when we work through this is, let's see if click's in the right place. We do a cluster analysis of teams across their software delivery performance, and software delivery performance is benchmarked according to 4 key metrics. We call them the 4 keys: deployment frequency, lead time for changes, how often are we shipping, and how long does it take us from commit to prod for each of those deployments. And then time to restore service. When something goes wrong, how long does it take us to get it back up and running, and how often does that happen? How often do we have that oh, oopsie moment? So that's a blend, as you can see, of velocity and stability. And then we do a cluster analysis across our team. So, and what we found is that there's 4 clusters. And in each of these clusters, these are where we are this year in terms of how people are achieving. And as you can see, there's a pretty big diversity between the different groups. The elite teams, as we call them, are deploying multiple times per day, whereas the low teams, it's once or twice a year. And at the same time, the elite teams have better stability metrics. Their change failure rates are lower, and their time to restore service is significantly faster. So the elite teams are able to ship faster and more reliably, and they're able to do so consistently. So how do they do that? Well, we're going to look at a few highlights, and you can find a full capability catalog of what people do that makes them successful at cloud.google.com/DevOps. I'm going to give you some of the highlights here. Now, I mentioned the 4 keys. So there's the 4 keys of software delivery performance. We also have a 5th key about operational performance. And we used to call this availability. We started studying it 2 years ago. This year, to align with the language of SRE, we started calling it reliability, because reliability really encompasses something broader than availability. Reliability means availability, but also means latency. It also means correctness. It means our ability to keep our promises to our users. So that's now incorporated into our model. And one of the first things that we notice as we look at this year is that acceleration is as hot as it ever has been. COVID has not slowed us down. And there was a GitHub analysis that also showed that commit rates have increased throughout the pandemic. So those elites who first appeared back in 2018, but prior to that, there had only been 3 buckets. We started noticing this group of people who were even above and beyond. They're now 26% of the industry. And the elite plus high is the majority of respondents that we have. So everyone is really kind of shifting upwards, and we're starting to see a lot of differentiation between those high performers and low performers. And honestly, if folks are in that lower side of things, there's reason for concern. But we're here to help. So what's the deal with these elite performers? Well, this is what we call our boom stats. Boom! Look how big these are. So the elite performers are deploying 973 times more frequently, right? Multiple times per day. They've gone well beyond that Flickr DevOps of 10 deploys a day, and a lot of these teams are deploying dozens of times per day, and they're so much faster of getting commit to prod, and you can immediately see the value of that lead time to deploy. That's the time that it takes from a unit of value to be built in your code base to get it to users. And of course, that is predictive of business success, right? At the same time, stability, so much better. The same metric, and this has to do with the way we phrase our questions, 6,500 times faster to recover from incidents. These are teams that are really practiced at deploying software and are able to deploy software to recover rollbacks or fix forwards much faster. And their change failure rate is lower. It's 1/3 as likely that each change is going to break as for the low performers. This one is a little bit interesting for fans of the report. Last time in 2019, we found that was a 7 times. And this time it's only 3 times. So a lot of ways to interpret that. The way I tend to interpret that is that I think the folks who are in that low group are there because they're acting very conservatively, right? They're shipping very rarely, but they're also able to have some measure of stability. That is okay. But obviously much better is to ship fast and don't break things. And what we find is that by moving faster, we actually have better stability. But I think that people, as teams move up out of that very lower level, the ones who are left are the real rock solid ones, but who unfortunately aren't moving fast enough to keep up with their competitors. The things that we probed deeply this year, several topics. One of them is about cloud and what's going on with cloud. Now, we have long found that cloud is an important driver of technical success. It's one of our capabilities. And this year we went a little deeper into what do people do with cloud. So first off, we can see now a majority of respondents are using the public cloud or multiple public clouds, as well as a big number of hybrid cloud, 34% on hybrid cloud, and a very low percentage really who are still very rooted in data center on premise. So this drive to the cloud is happening, and it's accelerating. The really interesting thing here is we asked folks why would you use multiple cloud providers? Hybrid is a very hot topic, and there are different reasons, right? So one key reason, and kind of I think the one that has been most traditionally talked about, is stuff about disaster recovery or availability, right? The belief that clouds may have some vulnerabilities, reliability challenges, right? There's some risk there, and so we want to spread that risk. And that is a reason for using multiple clouds, and it's one that customers seem to have some benefit from. But the leading one is that they want to leverage unique benefits of each provider. So what we're seeing is that technology organizations are getting, I think they're becoming savvy shoppers and realizing that they can kind of mash up different cloud providers and get benefits from all of them based on their unique differentiators, whether that's an API that others don't offer or a service, perhaps, whatever it is. Those unique differentiators are essential drivers. And so I think it's a message to cloud providers is, this isn't strictly a commodity, right? Which sometimes people might paint it as. That there are real value adds here. Now, another thing that we've looked at in the past and went deeper this year is, what does cloud mean, right? So we can say, I use the cloud. I have a contract with a cloud provider. But that can mean a lot of different things in terms of what I'm achieving with that cloud and how I use that cloud, right? Is the cloud just a data center that happens to live in another building, or is it a different kind of technology? And our research indicates that it's a different kind of technology, right? Teams that use cloud are outperform those who don't. But the way they're using cloud is what lets them outperform. And so NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, defines 5 characteristics of what cloud really means, right? To get benefits of cloud, you need all 5 of these characteristics to really be happening. They're on-demand self-service, broad network access, ability to get it from anywhere, resource pooling, that's bin packing in the cloud, rapid elasticity, that one's my favorite, right? Scale up, scale down, maybe even automatically, and measured service, pay as you go. As you can see, across the board, teams responded that they're getting more of these benefits from their cloud providers, which means they're able to really get a better ROI from their cloud spend, and this is continuing to accelerate. So, I was working with a customer just earlier today, and say, like, as you're planning a cloud migration, be looking not just as a success metric of get to the cloud, but let's look at it from what are the benefits we hope to unlock. And it may be that step 1 is just get to the cloud, but step 2 is where the real ROI happens, and that's when we start to unlock these capabilities. We also looked at site reliability engineering, SRE, and how it relates to DevOps. So SRE is a form of technical operations that originated at Google and really grew up at kind of in parallel to DevOps. But SRE was happening inside Google for a while. DevOps was happening very publicly. And then in about 2016, we published a book, and these two kind of met in the common forum. And that led to a lot of interesting questions, like, what's the difference? Which one's better? Which one should I choose? And we've said for a long time, we've said SRE implements DevOps as a technical metaphor, right? So that's pretty cool. It's people, kind of got, okay, so they're both, parts, lenses on the same kind of thing. This year, we really wanted to go deeper and kind of prove that out and say, are teams that practice SRE, are they practicing DevOps? Do these work together? And so for the first time, we incorporated a number of questions into the survey about SRE style practices. And we kind of de-jargoned it and asked people more generic questions about things like, how do they define reliability? What's their use of automation? Are they doing incident response drills? Things like that. And when we did that, we found that SRE is widely practiced. This was, to me, a real surprise, honestly, because there's the number of companies that say they have a big SRE practice is comparatively low. But when we de-jargon it, 52% of organizations that we surveyed were doing SRE to some degree or another. And then we also found that SRE is highly congruent and compatible with DevOps. So teams that practice SRE are able to achieve greater outcomes on those metrics that we study in the DORA survey. An interesting thing that we saw is that there's somewhat of an independent movement between reliability work and software delivery work. They don't necessarily predict each other, but taken together, they predict business outcomes. So I like to say that SRE is a force multiplier for software delivery. And teams that have both of them really working together are 1.8 times more likely to report better business outcomes. In security, we dug a little deeper on shifting left, which means the degree to which teams incorporate security practices throughout the SDLC, right? The anti-pattern is at the end, before we ship, the last day, we're going to ask our security team to review it. And that can be a grinding halt, and it can cause a lot of tension between teams. So the better practice is to have security shifted left, or as I like to call it, smeared left, because you still have it at the right. What you do is you have it all the way through. And what we saw is that the elite performers who also are performing on reliability were twice as likely to be doing that shifting left practice. And the teams that do that shifting left, it doesn't come at a cost to their business. In fact, teams that shifted left successfully were 1.6 times more likely to exceed or meet those organizational goals, those business outcomes. How do we do that, right? What are the practices? Here's a summary of some of the best practices that we recommend that are contributive to those outcomes. So bringing tests that vet security and automating them. Having, as I mentioned, security review in every phase. Really having security experts as part of the process. Pre-approved code. This one is something that we found that it can be a long pull for a lot of customers, but it's really powerful to have the security team provide things that are pre-vetted so that they don't have to slow you down at the end. And importantly, the cultural side of it, inviting InfoSec into the process and really being partners with them. I'll call out here that, sometimes it's thought of that the pattern that we're looking for is that everyone does security. We say security is everyone's job, right? Sometimes that means, well, it's nobody's job. And our best practice recommendation isn't that there's no security team and everyone's responsible for it. Instead, it's that there's a security team who are enablers, who are educators, and provide both knowledge and like guardrails and automation so that everyone else can more easily achieve the security we need. Documentation. So for the first time, we studied documentation. By documentation here, we're really speaking about internal documentation, our documentation to our own developers and to our own users. I think a lot of what you'll see here would also apply to external documentation to developer users. And what we found is that documentation is, again, it's not a trade-off. It's not a friction, right? It's really an enabler. The teams that have quality documentation are more likely to have security best practices, are more likely to reach their reliability targets via SRE best practices, more likely to fully leverage the cloud. Technical DevOps capabilities this is kind of a summary of some of the things that we found are predictive of performance. And some of these we've been studying for a long time, some are relatively new. But these are the things that come up over and over again as we work with customers, work with users to say, how do I optimize my DevOps practice? And so things like loosely coupled architecture is huge. Having teams being able to independently advance their software. Continuous integration, continuous testing, continuous delivery really lies at the nexus of a lot of our predictive model that helps us get our code out to the users faster. And then having that those monitoring observability practices to rapidly remediate. You can immediately see how a really great observability practice is going to immediately improve our time to restore or our change fail rate. Now, I want to talk a little about culture. In fact, I want to talk a lot about culture, but we're only going to talk a little. Culture is a really powerful lever for improving our technical capabilities. And in 2018, we found that high-performing teams are twice as likely to use a single cross-functional team. So that's a key aspect of culture, is how we group ourselves. And we find that a cross-functional team maybe correlated kind of that two pizza team kind of idea, where that team has all the knowledge and the authority to do what they need to for their users. They're often really great guardrails and expectations in place, but then they can move quickly within those boundaries. And a generative culture, I'll speak in a moment about what that means. A generative culture that really prioritizes information flow and trust predicts high performance. We also found this year that high-performing organizations are likely to encourage employees to take calculated risks without fear of negative consequences. So this aspect of learning, right? The learning is the work. And that idea has really been reinforced by what we found in terms of outcomes. Now, generative organizational culture, what does that mean? We've been studying for a few years now, how do you typify culture? How do you measure it? And what is its impact? There's a sociologist named Ron Westrom who's been studying for years team cultures in high information and often high pressure environments, places like emergency rooms. And he and his team have divided the cultures in those environments into three. And I want to mention that in those contexts, the outcomes are really visible and often very serious, right? Like an emergency room, outcomes matter. And what he found is that they can be clustered into three types. There's what we call a pathological type. Obviously, that doesn't sound so great. Pathological type is very power-oriented. Individuals are looking out for themselves and trying to, and they think of it often as a zero-sum game, right? If I win, you have to lose. And information, new novel information, which is really a key part of how we look at culture. Novel information is crushed because it might threaten my position. Then kind of in the middle, we have what we call a bureaucratic culture. And this is often a traditional model of a corporate culture where there's a lot of rules, a lot of structure, and a lot of silos, right? Everyone is in their own corporate silo. And in order to really make progress, in order to learn things, you have to do a lot of bureaucratic hopping between teams. So new information is we want to try and contextualize it and put it back into our framework of what we already understand. Finally, generative culture. This is the win. Generative culture is one where new information is seen as an opportunity to investigate. And teams are encouraged to work together and explore new ideas together. And this is very much related to the notion of psychological safety. And that relates to that idea that employees are encouraged to take risks without fear of negative consequences. So being able to express ideas, express uncertainty, admit mistakes, all of that is psychological safety. And we find that that's a really key input into organizational performance. So businesses that outperform that's predicted by businesses that have a culture of trust and empowerment. Last thing I want to talk about as a deep dive here is COVID, right? How has COVID affected software delivery across the industry? We did not see a downward trend. It didn't really slow down. And in fact, there are signs that the industry has continued to accelerate. Software does seem to work distributed, right? And as we've seen, the higher performing teams are now the majority. One of the things that we found that was really, really key here is that, COVID has been tough, right? It's been tough being isolated. It's been tough being away from our teams, but there are mitigations. And teams with that generative team culture that I described, with people who felt inclusive, who felt like they belonged, felt like they had a sense of mission and trust with their coworkers, were half as likely to experience burnout because of the pandemic or during the pandemic. So we can have a productive team in these challenging times. And I think it's an important lesson for whatever our next big challenge is, by building that trust and that team communication pattern, that'll insulate us to some degree from negative effects of what's coming next. To sum up, we continue to see that DevOps brings benefits to organizations, and this continues to accelerate. We found some insights into SRE, secure software supply chain, documentation, and using the cloud. Happy to speak more about some of those parts, and Kelly certainly is very happy to speak about these parts as well. We do want to say thank you to everyone who helped us. If the folks here contributed to the survey, thank you. If you didn't, hop on next time, because we definitely want to get your insight, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. So I will turn off my presentation.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that was great. And now we're going to dig into that a bit deeper. So if I start with Dave, when you started off the report, was there anything in the outcomes that surprised you, that you went against the hypothesis, or just when it emerged, it was like, okay, I hadn't thought about this, but it makes total sense?
Yeah, I'll speak specifically in the SRE portion, which is the part that I was most involved in. A couple of things surprised me. First was the breadth of adoption of SRE. A pleasant surprise, but this had been kind of a concern of like, is this a thing outside of Google SRE and Facebook production engineering? We know that there are some major organizations that have adopted this. Got to pull up my props here. We know that other organizations have succeeded. It's a great book, available free online, to learn about how they've done it. But I was really surprised to see this really widespread adoption of these kinds of practices. And another thing that I didn't mention is that across the board, from low to elite, the spread of adoption of those reliability engineering practices is really wide. So at every level, there is room for improvement. And we see this, at Google, where we originated SRE, that we have teams of all different levels, all different engagement models, and we're continuing to evolve and grow. The other thing I'll mention very briefly that was a surprise to me is that the signal we found, we did not find a predictive influence of reliability engineering on software development. I had a hypothesis that SRE practices would help teams ship more frequently. And we found that they really are working more independently than that. And I think there's more to explore. There may be some nuance, but at this point, we see them independent. But then again, coming together as kind of, the Wonder Twins or something to make your business really succeed when you're firing across both of those disciplines.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that's great. I think we do get those questions regularly in our community. What is SRE? How does it relate to DevOps? So I'm so happy that you address those.
And
Okay,
I love,
go
just
ahead.
to jump in, like I love how you talk about the de-jargonization, because I think syncs up with some of the things that we've been kind of like hearing and seeing, is that people often they're doing good practices, but not necessarily knowing that they're falling under this kind of rubric of a certain type of set of practices.
Yeah, there's it's easy to call out kind of the opposite of that, which is, oh, that team says they're doing DevOps, but they're not really, which is something that we should be aware of. But we also need to look the other way. And I think one of the things that we've seen, and this is really re-emphasized, is that SRE and DevOps and psychological safety and agile and lean, there's a lot of shared DNA, and a lot of things evolved independently. And I think really represents something even more fundamental that we're continuing to discover about how we do technical work. And so sometimes these words, this jargon, can get in our way of realizing that there's a lot of shared values here.
Great. Okay. So the thing I found that stood out for me, and because it was new and I loved it a lot, was the documentation side. So for the first time, the report measured quality of documentation and found teams with high quality documentation perform better as a whole. I mean, is this a surprise? And like, Kelly, what are your thoughts? Did that come as a surprise to you?
I'm going to say, so I am not surprised that teams that have, good, solid documentation practices and good documentation perform better at all. And just like a little bit of background, I have worked as a tech writer, but I've also worked as a test and release manager. So doing, kind of like slightly more engineering, kind of side of things, and seeing the effect that internal documentation can have on that. And I've also taught technical communication to computer science majors, and just kind of going through even just in that world and seeing teams that were like, okay, we're actually going to do the part where we're asked to put together a README for our like project, or install docs, and just seeing that kind of correlation between that and how well they actually did in the software development part of the course. So I was not surprised. I was also not surprised to see that in this report. I was maybe like a little bit surprised that people that was kind of asked, but I'm not surprised that people are paying more attention to the importance of good documentation, especially internal documentation. And part of that has to do with the kind of shift to remote and distributed work that we've all been kind of going through. And there's a bit of a pendulum shift back, but some of the practices that we've seen and become reliant on, because we all had to kind of shift the way that we worked, I think some of the good things that have come out of it are not necessarily going to go away. So I was not terribly surprised to see it in the report, and was not surprised at all to see that correlation was made.
Awesome. And Dave, what was your definition, like high quality documentation? What are the characteristics that make that up?
I'm glad you asked. And this, of course, is contained in the report, but I'll highlight the headlines here. So first off is document critical use cases for your products and services, meaning take that user-centric idea of what are you trying to achieve with this tool, and speak to the user's goal of what and describe the journey from that perspective. Next three, are all really about process around documentation. I think there's a lot of folks who recognize we really want to have better documentation, but how do we really achieve that? How do we incentivize it? So one thing, clear guidelines for updating and editing, and defining owners. Who owns this document? Who are we going to seek out, and who are going to put it at the top of their queue if it's stale? Something we do at Google, and I know there are tools that can help this everywhere, is have an automated process that alerts the owner when the documentation hasn't been touched in, say, 4 months. Oh, okay. Hey, take a review. Make sure this is still valid. And then the next one is include documentation as part of the software development process, right? Really couple it with the process of writing the code and releasing that service, that product. And finally, recognize documentation work during performance reviews and promotions. Incentives matter, and we really have to make sure that we appreciate that that is the work product of the engineering team as well.
That last one is, I'm not going to say it's my absolute favorite because I love all of these, but it's for me, it's like, it is such a blocker for so many teams and organizations, is that like you get good documentation because someone cares to create it and to maintain it and to do all of those types of things. And some teams and some orgs get by because it is one person has taken it upon themselves to do that. And even though it's like this unrecognized glue work that nobody is giving them accolades for or even recognizing it, and that's absolutely horrible. But that is sometimes how teams get by. And then when that can shift to a more team-wide or organizational-wide appreciation for the importance of documentation, it's a whole new ballgame.
Amen. I'm curious, Kelly, your thought on what's the role of technical writers in this process as opposed to engineers who know the things about the thing they're building? I'm
so glad you asked, because I mean, how many hours can we just talk about the relationship between writers and what we call subject matter experts? But one of the trends that we've certainly seen has been both the kind of increased recognition that technical writing and technical communication is in fact a skill, and it can be an area of expertise that is valuable. But also we're seeing an increased interest in helping developers become better writers and better communicators. And I think both of those things are like absolutely essential. So like imagine like on a given cross-functional team, you have people who, it's a cross-functional team, but we have people who have expertise in different things. And imagine if someone on that team just happened to have expertise in writing and communication, as well as, maybe some other things. And that again changes the way that you look at the role that writing and communication plays in software development.
Absolutely. Putting back my my product manager hat, I was a product manager for developer products for a while, and that experience helped me see that I think in every product, but especially in developer facing things, the documentation is the product surface. This is how they understand the product. It's how they appreciate it. It's how we shape their expectations of it. And so, as I think a part of the DevOps mind shift is saying to developers, like, your job is not just to write some code, your job is to provide a service, and documentation is an essential part of that continued value delivery.
It is. And there's a phrase out there, and this is not my phrase, and I think it's on t-shirts, but it's docs where it didn't happen. There are memes about it. People tweet about it. And I very much feel that it is. And the thing I love about the area of the report that talks about documentation is that it is looking at internal documentation, because there is increasing acceptance that documentation, like external documentation, user documentation, is so important in terms of getting users to be able to use stuff. And often when you're talking about things that developers, like developer kind of products and software development products, documentation is often seen as like a part of marketing, right? How developers even become aware of and see that. So external documentation is being seen as valued increasingly, but I think that internal practices that actually help teams build better software and do it faster, and all the other things that we see high and elite performing teams do, that is finally getting some attention.
That feels consistent with the trend I've been seeing of internal product managers, which is something that we at Google have had various ups and downs on. I'm hearing a lot from customers working with as well, treating your internal facing services as proper products with product managers.
Yeah, platform as a product. We're definitely hearing a lot more of that from our end users, and that would include proper documentation. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So documentation maybe is about to have its moment. I don't know if we need a buzzword for that, a DocOps or something, but yes, so good to see it elevated.
There is, oh my goodness, there was, okay, so Heidi Waterhouse at Launch Darkly gave a talk at DevOps Loop a couple weeks ago, and her talk, she called it Dev Tech DocOps. And we should just go with that. yeah, I can't say it, but I will practice it until I can say it more. And you know, she talked a bit about the findings in the report as well. And I think one of the best images that she had about this was like documentation is like laundry; it is never done, right?
And speaking of things which are never done, let's move to security. And, so yeah, great to see that also be highlighted and have its moment. And again, just be pretty convincing in terms of good security practices, just are very indicative of how your teams are doing. I like this question here from Kara. She's asking, is security becoming a sixth metric within the framework? We just saw this addition of availability. What about security?
So I'll speak for the from the DORA perspective. Would love to hear your perspectives as well, which is that in terms of the analytical framework, security is not a metric, and part of the reason is that we don't know how to measure it. And I think that's a really interesting question. How can we measure security? We actually have some of these challenges with reliability, though we're a little closer, but it's some of the same thing of how do you measure the lack of something, right? How many incidents that didn't happen are you going to recognize? And so that's really hard. We definitely are seeing it as that input. Teams that incorporate security are more successful, right, at their business practices. And it's reasonable to, I think, intuit that these teams are having fewer security problems, and I won't say, breaches, but, alerts and remediations, and that therefore that's letting them ship faster. But to date, we haven't been able to really measure it in the way that we measure those metrics.
Great. So we're starting to see just this emergence of more, I guess, in-depth conversations and just breaking out what it means. And I loved your phrase, both Kelly and I were saying that the smeared left, and just that approach.
Sometimes, I mean, I've worked with customers who have said, "Oh, that means it's not the security team's problem anymore, right?" Oh no, it's still your problem too, but we spread it.
We're gonna just nice, great visual picture.
Well, because it can't turn into like it's everybody's problem and then it is nobody's problem. That's not where we're going. And Dave, I really liked how you talked about imagining the role of like security within teams as being like, right, it's not that it's nobody has any expertise in security anymore and everybody is a security expert, because that does not work. But the idea of, all right, what if things were set out, such as like guardrails or golden paths, or there are other language I think that is used to apply to this, but like pre-approved code and ways of doing things, that it's good from a security perspective, because you're like, okay, this stuff is safe, these dependencies are okay, this is all good. But also in terms of when a developer is going and trying to figure out like what pieces to use, there's already this like curated set of choices for them that are noted as secure. So it could help with that, speeding up that process as well.
Absolutely. And I feel this parallels what you were saying about documentation, where a tech writer may create like a style guide and then help the engineers to actually adhere to it.
Great. And yeah, no, I think with security, it does feel like it's gaining that importance. Certainly last week at KubeCon, there was a supply chain secure conference, and that was like the best attended of the co-located events at KubeCon, and folks from SolarWinds talking about the Sunburst hack and all the measures having to put in place. So yeah, I encourage folks to check out those videos and just there's a real need here to just get better as an industry at security practices. Okay, so from there, let's go back to high performers, and I want to dig into some of those numbers, because I think there's some really impressive ones on the elite performers. The incredible, the best keep getting better, but like 6,000 times better, and those numbers just keep really cramping up. And I think that's kind of a big message for everybody. Like if you're not moving, you need to catch up, or you're falling further and further behind. Huge numbers, Dave. Any thoughts on that? Did those surprise you?
Well, I think they surprised me the first time I saw them reading a report several years ago. But every time we have some of those giant numbers, the fact that they're continuing to grow, that spread is continuing to grow, is definitely a bit of a surprise. Acceleration is the name of the game. And, a lot of it is about automation, about helping robots and humans each do the things that they are good at. And and on that note of automation, I'll mention that a lot of this stuff it's a win-win, right? We've talked about how you get velocity and you get stability, you get security and reliability, share a lot of the same practices. But also another win is about people culture. And so one of the things we see is that these teams that are moving the fastest also have lowest levels of burnout, do the least amount of rework. And so these same practices, we can't measure it exactly, but you might say that those same teams have 6,000 times better culture.
Amazing. So much for 10x developers. You've got a 6,000x team.
That's the right answer. You can't, someone told me recently, there's no such thing as a 10x developer, but there is a 10x team.
Yeah, or in this case, 6,000x team.
Yeah.
The numbers are there. But like on the elite teams, the one number that 25 or 26% elite teams, I got to say, for me, that number doesn't feel reflective of the industry. So that seemed really, really high. Just because when we talk to folks, we still see so many people struggling to deliver more frequently and to get past CI. So is there just better adoption of that language? Do people want to be perceived as elite, or what's going on there? Because I think that number is the one number I felt like maybe doesn't represent the industry as a whole.
It's always good to have scrutiny here. I'll mention that the way that is done is through cluster analysis with statistics that I don't quite understand, but that's why we have data scientists, statisticians in the program. And Nicole Forsgren's book, Accelerate, really about half of it describes the analytical methods. So in terms of the math itself, there's something there that elite bucket exists. Why are there so many of them? And I think that, certainly that there's reason to ask, is there some selection bias in folks that are participating in our survey? Probably some. We do take a lot of effort through the methods that we gather participants from to really cast a very wide net. But I also do think that that what we're seeing is that some of the sort of I'm going to overstate this. The dinosaurs are being left behind, and remember that these metrics predict business outcomes, right? And so the teams that aren't succeeding at DevOps are more likely to be struggling with business, and maybe they're not around so much anymore. This is a hypothesis.
Yeah, and I guess the cluster analysis, I noticed I didn't notice this, but somebody pointed out on Twitter, the buckets for the high performers, this is slightly different from what we've seen in the past. So they've almost kind of widened them. Does that make it difficult to kind of compare like for like with past years, or how do we kind of approach?
Again, I'm not an expert on the analytical methods, but I do know that it's been in 2000 since 2018. It's been four buckets, and then what we've seen is within that bucket, their abilities are changing, right? So the elite performers, the highest performers now, are delivering faster than they had been, and then they're also growing as a group. So we think we can draw some inference about like for like. Is it exactly precise? I think enough that our statisticians feel good about it. And I think it also, would tend to align with other observations and our experiences of I don't know of any team that's shipping less code or that's shipping it slower. Some of them are accelerating faster than others.
Yeah, go ahead, Kelly.
So there was the introduction of the elite bucket, right? That was not there from the start. Is there a point where we end up with an elite plus bucket?
It could be, we go where the math takes us. The names, we get to make up the names, but the math takes us there. And if a fifth bucket emerges, it seems entirely plausible that it may be that we need to introduce an elite plus. frankly, at that time, we probably should change the words, because now low is more like, and elite becomes the new normal.
Yeah, and we've certainly had conversations. I know some folks hate the term elite, or they kind of have these connotations, but yeah, I think we're focusing on the specifics of what that means in terms of, these metrics which have been proven to tie directly to business outcomes is what's key. So,
and it is an opportunity to mention that those elite teams are not random collections of elite individuals. And in fact, our research has shown that the highest performing teams are not when you draw the highest performing individuals and stick them together. That's a finding that's been reinforced in a lot of contexts, including like Navy SEAL teams. They don't form them from the highest testers. And so it's the team that's elite, and anyone can be part of an elite team, and any manager and any leader has the opportunity to nurture the things that will make their teams elite.
Absolutely. Anyone can be part of an elite team. I love that, and I don't think it gets emphasized enough. Okay, so speaking of teams and culture, that incredible statement about people who feel included are half as likely to experience burnout during the pandemic. I mean, wow, that was at this time. We are seeing so much on burnout from our community, direct contributors and people talking about the teams they're working with. So it's incredible that it feels like there's almost a solution or a golden path which we should all be leaning into. Any comments around burnout and culture, Kelly?
Oh my! Well, again, so many. I could talk about that for kind of an hour. And again, it is burnout, and discussions of it are almost pervasive. And I'm not even on an engineering team, and I definitely had like my mini spout with like dealing with like burnout, like looking it down and being like, nope, not gonna go that way. So there's so much talk about it, and it is not a surprise to find that people who are members of teams that make them feel included and that they are important and that they belong, and that are functional, like nicely functioning teams are experiencing less burnout. At the same time, I think it's like a good caution to be like, that's not going to just keep burnout from happening ever, right? This is something that's going to make it less likely. But I do feel that talking about things like psychological safety, even aside from the kind of trend of burnout and almost like job hopping, that extra job leaving and job hopping that we're seeing in the tech industry right now, that element of psychological safety, I think, is also an important one, even if we were not talking about pandemic-driven burnout, right? In that the types of things that elite and high-performing teams do to get that way, to be able to move faster without breaking things, there is an element of risk in that. And I think the psychological safety element especially is all right, you can take the risk, and there are things in place where you are not going to somehow find yourself completely out of a job if this one thing does not end out well. And I think that's something that we don't talk about enough.
And Kelly, you talked about job hopping, and I think retention is such an important part of this whole topic, and the value you mentioned earlier. SMEs, subject matter experts, right? That expertise. You can't take an online course to learn the specifics of my application in my context with my customers. So retaining engineers and other roles is a real essential to long-term business viability.
It absolutely is. And it's retention, and also like talent acquisition plays into that as well, right? In terms of reputations, like companies get reputations about what it's like to work there, and teams, even within organizations, the teams have reputations of like, okay, this is a good team to work for, and this one isn't. And I feel that when we're looking about the world of like talent acquisition and hiring and retention and even upskilling, which that in and of itself is somewhat of a risk, right? So being able to take time in order to learn to do new things, and there's always that fear that you're not going to do that as well as your former job. So again, going back to that psychological safety, again, not surprised at all that is kind of tied to teams that do well.
That risk and psychological safety, I think you're touching on the risks that managers and leadership have to take about I hear some concerns of, if I upskill my people, well, they're going to go leave to somewhere else.
Yes.
And it's like, what we see is that the organizations that succeed are the ones who take that risk.
It is. And you kind of have to have a little bit of the feeling that, all right, we're going to help people learn new things, and we're going to treat them well enough that they're not going to want to leave. And if you don't have that, like, you're like, all right, what do we need to do to make them not want to leave?
Yeah, and it feels like the industry is having that wake-up call at the moment. I think people are dubbing it, the Great Resignation, or just the sheer amount of movement. And then we had in-person events with KubeCon last week, so it might have a second wave of. It seems I like the whole idea of you need to take that risk and just focus on retention and psychological safety, and hope that message is coming across.
Yeah.
What would we advise, like, companies who do want to fix things, they want to make their cultures more generative? Any kind of tips or things you've seen work well at other companies?
Any thoughts, Kelly?
The thing that jumped into mind immediately was, Dave, as you mentioned, the not being the place where you think people are going to leave if they somehow grow or change, right? So anytime you can look at it, not just your team as being something that is beyond the sum of its parts, but the people that on your team as being more than just what they contribute, to the team. I think that's like a really good starting place.
I'll add the model that we often talk about in a DORA context is one where you can't simply show up and create culture, right? You can't just say, hey, we have a new culture now. And culture is emergent from practices. It's what people do. I have a friend who's been in therapy recently. I've been in therapy, and therapists will say, feeling follows action, right? And the same thing applies to the work. You do the action that is really consistent with the behavior, with the values that we have, and people start doing that. So this is what we advise as a way to create that generative culture, is to create tooling and processes that really reinforce those values.
Yeah, and I think going back to just DevOps as a larger concept, I think one thing I don't think we've touched on in our conversation is how much culture is seen as a part of like DevOps, in addition to the kind of process and tools and where the people kind of fit in. And I think finding that balance is super important, because I think as Dave, I think you noted at the beginning, it's like the flip side of some of the ways we look at DevOps. So people are doing SRE without knowing it's SRE, is like people trying to say DevOps is a thing that it isn't. So just being like, here, I've labeled this, kind of what it is, but without, or buying it as like, here's a tool and I now have DevOps. It's not going to work that way.
So true. Tools matter, absolutely, and tools reinforce. But adoption of the tool shouldn't be a goal in of itself. It won't have been worth the investment if that's our only measure of success.
Absolutely. Okay, I want to allow some time for Amika's question. He asks, I'm curious if end user quality was covered in the research. The challenge of balancing across the three-legged CI/CD velocity, SRE reliability, and quality or end user experience.
That's a great question, and it's one that that the DORA framework talks about lean product processes and fast feedback cycles from the user. We don't have as much to say about how to make sure that the product is what the users want. It's more about getting our product ideas to the user with some aspects in that lean product recommendation about understanding what the user wants. But we're not prescriptive about what your product should do. We mostly instead say your product should be informed by your users, and let's have those information channels to make sure that can be both high fidelity, rapid, and actionable in your product development process.
And Kelly, maybe I can ask you, like, I know we talk about end user experience, so sometimes we'll talk about the developer experience. And I know Red Monk talks a lot about the developer experience gap. Do you think there's more happening there to just address that or tie it in with your overall strategy?
We talk about the developer experience gap a lot, especially we talk to a lot of people who make software that developers use to build other software, right? So those are developers, but they're end users of a given software, and they're producing other software. So it's kind of like, here's like the great chain of being, but the software development version of it. And there's a lot of talk about that. And I mean, we've been talking about it for a while, but now people are like coming to us with this idea instead of us like being like, here, you need to pay attention to it. Because there's so many developers especially have so much choice in terms of what they use. Maybe the choice is slightly different when they're in a big enterprise and are kind of being told what to use a little bit more. In a DevOps context, I think we did talk about there are tools that are kind of put out there as like solutions for DevOps, which I don't know that entirely works, but tools that are helping to kind of smooth over the number of choices and the kind of pathways that developers have, I think can be extremely useful. Again, in going to things where you're talking about guardrails, or you're talking about golden paths, about things that are kind of like pre-approved within an organization for security reasons, or because they can be supported, or because they're things that people have like tried and determined have worked in the past. And kind of these things have always existed in some ways, but in some places they have existed only by word of mouth or by practice. And again, going to that idea of internal documentation is one of the things your internal documentation can do is help figure out what those things are before they get into the more kind of like formative or like formal ways of doing things.
Okay. And yeah, I'm gonna just noticing the time. So thanks everybody for joining. Let's say Continuous Delivery Foundation. We're here to help everybody deliver value faster by adopting continuous delivery practices. We're so happy to dig into the State of DevOps report, which is just an incredible body of research. And so just to finish, if I had to ask each of you just to highlight, one key takeaway or one parting thought for everybody listening, what would that be? And who wants to go first?
I went first last time.
Okay, Dave, go for it.
So simple, it's start small. Find one bottleneck, find one capability to improve. Start with one team if needed, and try things, experiment, learn from it, and then share what you've learned throughout the organization, share the successes and share the failures. It's that knowledge that is what is important to build. And as we create that knowledge and share the kind of excitement around these ways of working, it starts to propagate on its own.
Love it so much. Kelly.
And mine is going to be less broad. Like I'm going to all documentation all the time. But in terms of that creation and sharing of knowledge, I think it's super important. So yes, value documentation, value people who write it, give credit to people who write it. And I very much hope that in the same way that the State of DevOps report made the idea that you can move fast and kind of do really good quality code, that this is going to help give visibility to oh my goodness, if you have good internal documentation practices, that can also help you move fast and have really good code.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dave and Kelly. Really great insights, a really great discussion. I'm really privileged to enjoy it. And thanks to everybody in the audience who has joined us today. The recording will be available instantly on YouTube. And for future events, we'll be taking a bit of a break, but we'll be back in December where we'll have our End User Council coming back to discuss the state of governance and compliance in software delivery. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.